Alright, for those of you who are seeing this on the main channel, which is most of you, then you would have seen the post saying that this is the only time where an episode of Season 3 of the podcast can be on both here and the gaming channel. After this, it is only exclusive to the latter, alright? However, you can view it if you head on over to the gaming channel. So, do that and enjoy the show. It was all done. The final sentence is a signal to the audience that the first episode of the third season was complete. I placed my hand on the mouse and moved the cursor to the stop button on my Audacity. I leaned back in my gaming chair, and it was finished. In order to make sense of this, I need to head back to the beginning of the show, where it all began. Hello and welcome to the JDF podcast. This is an episodic review series where I can review anything, but not everything. That includes monster movies, both big and small, anime, and video games. Holy shit, it's been a while since I said that. So, if you have migrated over from my main channel, JDF VA, you would have known its former name, the Brumakian Podcast. But like I said in episode 58.5, the podcast, and the channel for that matter, would have been given a name change. Now, most of you are thinking, why in the good Lord's name are you starting off on episode 59 instead of, episode 1? Well, first, there's already an episode 1 on the main channel. Second, this is a continuation of the podcast from said main channel. And I know that you're saying just start over again, but folks, I'm not going to. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into this. The way I do things is that I go over the background of each product, give a brief synopsis, and give my final thoughts at the end. However, in some circumstances, I need a lot more background, like the history behind what started this whole thing in the first place. I did that with kaiju, I did that with anime, and I'm doing it now with video games. By the way, each game I'm reviewing will be in release order rather than at random. In other words, I will be reviewing the games in the year that they came out. And you may have noticed I will be playing and uploading gameplay on this channel, so that is a bonus. Hope you don't mind me muttering like a fucking moron. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the history of video games that leads into today's review. Three years after the Second World War, it was time for something new. There have been ancient computers, except it didn't look like your average monitor like a 2060, 3060, 70, 80, 90, or even any of the 40 series. In 1950, someone made a decision to play a game of tic-tac-toe, or Nimrod as it was called, and the system back then was only useful for lining up electric displays or as a demonstration exhibit. Little did anyone know in 1950 that the computer would only grow and nothing would be able to stop it. In 1958, William Higginbotham, who was at the Brookhaven National Lab, created a game called Tennis for Two for a 3-day exhibition. And it was popular for a while, but it was largely forgotten after being dismantled. 20 years later, with numerous court cases on the matter, was considered the first video game in history. Another game was considered to be the first in its own right. In April of 1962, a game was developed by Steve Russell at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to a wider distribution of audiences to be enjoyed. Its name, Space War. Space War was the first multiplayer video game, allowing 2 players to take part in space combat on the PDP-1 across the United States. The game was so popular that in 2007, it entered the Library of Congress, a research and de facto library for the United States Congress, with over 171 million items for being the most important video games in history. It is especially important for what came afterwards. During the 1960s, there was enthusiasm for mainframe and mini computer systems in order to play a good number of computer games. However, due to the scarcity of resources and the lack of sufficient trained programmers, let's be honest, it was dead on arrival. The latter of which was because there was a lack of interest in creating products and entertainment for different geographic areas. Everything would change, however, when the new decade arrived. Thanks to programming languages such as BASIC and C High Level being more widely available and accessible during the 1970s, it was much easier to open up a computer game creation to a large number of users. But it was a very slow process, to say the least. Back in 1966, the Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, developed Portal Unix operating systems at Bell Lab because of the widespread adoption of the PDP-10. Thanks to wide area networks like our Pennant that can be used for greater distances, many college students were influenced to develop video games during the 1970s. On the mainframe side, things like fast-paced and real-time gameplay were not possible due to the lack of 2 things. 1, adequate displays because many computer terminals at the time were still relying on teletypes rather than monitors, and 2, insufficient processing power and memory to update any game element. Yes, the 1970s version of mainframes were more powerful than any other device at the time, but it still hampered the ability of many game developers. Thankfully, they managed to develop strategy and puzzle mechanics instead of pure action. Star Trek, Hunt the Wumpus, Empire, and Colossal Cave Adventure. The latter of which was the first RPG role-playing game, and it, along with D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, was the first to establish a brand new genre on the digital front that focuses on fantasy exploration and puzzle solving. But then came along something that changed everything. Williams, Harrison, and Rouge refined Bear's concept of an entertainment box designed to be played in a family household. After patenting the technology within it, they took the brown box and its components to a company called Magnavox, and the rest is history. The Magnavox Odyssey was the first commercial game console in history, released in 1972. At the same time, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, after making the first recognized arcade video game, Computer Space, with the company Nunning Associates, don't ask, departed from the company and created their own. Its name, Atari, and after taking inspiration from table tennis, created the first game in the company's history, simply known as Pong. It was released in the same year as the Magnavox Odyssey. Pong on the Odyssey became the first video game console to be a success and receive universal acclaim, and this was the start of the home video game console industry. Although the Odyssey didn't catch on to the public eye until 1975, Magnavox released two versions of the system, the 100 and 200. Atari, on the other hand, started to enter the consumer market as well. It was the start of the gaming industry's golden age. There was another company that decided to enter the gaming industry. That company's name is Nintendo, created in 1889, originally as a trading card company. In 1973, the company created the laser clay shooting system, a light gun shooting simulation that surpassed bowling in popularity. The Japanese company entered a partnership with Mitsubishi, the one who makes cars, bikes, and aircraft, and created color TC gaming consoles. When the ball and paddle games were becoming oversaturated in 1975, a little thing took a leap forward for the gaming market: the arcade. Arcade games grew out of the pre-existing industry, which was dominated by electromechanical games. Across the Pacific Ocean, the Japanese company Sega, remember them later, trust me, released a game called Periscope in 1966. Atari's Breakout was another influence of the success of Pong, and it was one of the first arcade games. But Taito's designer, Tomohiro Nishikado, was inspired to create and set a standard for future arcade games. It was called Space Invaders. Released in Japan in 1978, Space Invaders was an immediate success, and while not as popular in the United States, it was still a success as well, with North American manufacturers moving 60,000 cabinets in 1979. Regulated live counts, gaining extra lives via points, high scores, it was the first arcade game where players would encounter wave after wave of enemies shooting back at them. And of course, despite it being a 4-note loop, it was the first to incorporate music in the background. What came after was an era that many of the older generation will remember: the golden age of arcade games. Asteroids, Galaxian, Defender, Missile Command, Tempest, Galaga, and Namco's Pac-Man. The latter, released in 1980, became the most popular out of all of them, and its sequel, Ms. Pac-Man, became a pop culture icon, which in itself kickstarted a new wave of video games which focused on identifiable characters and alternating game mechanics, like going through mazes or traveling through a series of platforms. One of those games that utilized that concept are Nintendo's Donkey Kong and Gottlieb's Q*bert. Because of these characters, they became the company's mascots for marketing purposes. Meanwhile, in the family homes came the first generation of video game consoles: the aforementioned Odyssey, the Atari Pong, the Coleco Telstar consoles, and the computer TV game, all of which was possible thanks to the use of game cartridges. The game cartridge allows many players to swap one game with another very easily without much trouble. The concept and idea came from the console Fairchild Channel by Fairchild Camera and Instruments in 1976, with Atari and Magnavox following in 1977. Heading into the 1980s, a new generation of consoles emerged: the Fairchild Channel F, the Atari 2600, and Mattel's Intellivision, the latter of which was what led Mattel Electronics to enter the gaming market. In 1980 and 1981, Atari bought the license for Space Invaders and made the game's port to the system the main attraction for the Atari VCS console. The game quadrupled in sales, selling over 2.5 million copies. As a result, the company's consumer sales went from $119 million to $841 million in that time frame. With the combination of the arcade games such as Missile Commander, Asteroids, and Defender ported over to the consoles, Atari became number one in the gaming industry, with Mattel and Magnavox coming in second and third respectively. However, Mattel would exit the gaming industry entirely sometime later. When one company left, another took its place. When a company or individual is leading a market or a trend for that matter, there is always going to be some sort of drama behind the scenes, as is in many forms of media and entertainment. Ray Kassar, a Warner Communication, and part of Atari's management had never held the company's programmers in the highest regard, an example of which was not crediting said programmers in the ending credits of many of their games. It did not sit well with them, especially with David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead. These four individuals departed from Atari in 1979. They, along with Jim Levy, decided to create their own company. On October 1st, 1979, Computer Art Inc. was established. Later on, the company would rebrand itself to Activision. Activision, in 1979, had been working out of David Crane's garage, with each developer working on their own game that was released sometime in the mid-1980s. Games like Dragstar, Fishing Derby, Checkers, and Boxing. In 1982, using their knowledge of creating video games for the Atari VCS, the crew created and published their own games. One of them was Pitfall. Atari sued the company, but settled out of court, with Activision themselves agreeing to pay a specific portion of Atari's game sales as a license fee. As a result, Activision didn't become a console first-party developer, but a third-party developer, the first company to become one. Following the creation of Imagic in 1981, another group of developers in Atari left and joined Activision. Meanwhile, Activision itself would face its finest challenger, Calico, and its console, the CalicoVision. Calico challenged Atari's dominance in the gaming industry and demonstrated it when they developed a licensed version of Nintendo's arcade hit Donkey Kong as a bundle to the CalicoVision. Because of this emergence, in 1982, Atari vowed that they would protect their spot at the top of the gaming industry, even though the Atari VCS outsold the CalicoVision by 30 million units to just 4 million. Nevertheless, the competition began. However, it would not last. Because of Activision's success as a third-party developer for the Atari VCS, more and more gaming companies became third-party developers throughout the early 1980s. Over 100 companies were created for the sole purpose of making software for the Atari VCS. As a result, there was a growing demand by the head of each company in North America for games that had to be developed in a short period of time and released at specific dates. Or, as we like to call it nowadays, crunch time or crunch time overload. Some game companies did hire experts in designing and programming into building quality games. However, most of them were novice programmers who had no experience in the field and were backed by, let's be honest, venture capitalists. Capitalism at its finest, ladies and gentlemen. As a result, many of the poorly made games had saturated the Atari VCS, with the games themselves not selling well as they should. It came to the point where retailers had to put the games on discount. One individual would believe that the most infamous game that was released in this time frame, E.T., a game that Atari invested so much money into the marketing because of the film that it was based on, was responsible for what came next. But in truth, the real reason was oversaturation. Too many games flooded the market so badly that the consumer's confidence in said market plummeted. In 1983 and 1984, several US game companies that produced consoles and games went bankrupt, resulting in a loss from $3 billion in 1983 to $100 billion by 1985. As for the global market, it dropped from $42 billion to $14 billion by 1985. As a result, Magnavox and Coleco went out of business, never to return again. And while Activision would survive, Atari itself would be sold off to Jack Tramiel of Commodore International in 1984. This also had an effect on the arcade and personal computer (PC) markets. It became known as the video game crash of 1983. However, it was not the end of the industry. Home computers would recover and return from the crash, and back across the Pacific Ocean, Nintendo went into the gaming console market, providing a system and starting a new renaissance in gaming, and with it, a new generation of consoles. The concept in which Nintendo wanted to approach is like any other gaming company at the time. Originally, they wanted to include a disk drive, but opted for the game cartridge. A design concept was made by Yasuyuki Yukawa, which ended up what came to the West. But the Japanese system was designed by Masayuki Uemura. That would be the Family Computer, or the Famicom for short, and would be released in the Japanese market on July 15, 1983. But when it came time for the West to get the system, the video game crash made them rethink some strategies, mainly the name. Like I said, gaming consoles were losing interest with the public, yet PCs were on the rise. The way that Nintendo did it was that they would market it like a toy that you would get at your, I don't know, your local Toys R Us or Blockbuster. Remember them? Instead of calling it a video game system, they would call it an entertainment system. And little did anyone know, the name would stick. The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, tested its release markets in New York in 1985 and LA 1 year later. Once it was safe, the NES was released nationwide. But the system didn't come without some launch titles to play. 17 in fact. Some of those games are 10-Yard Fight, Baseball, Clue Land, Excitebike, Golf, Gyromite Ice Climber, Kung Fu, Soccer, Stack Up, Tennis, Wrecking Crew, Wild Gunman, Hogan's Alley, not Hulk Hogan's Alley, and Gun Hunt. The latter three actually came with a bonus attached to the system, the NES Zapper. However, out of all of the games that I mentioned, there was one that stuck out among the rest. And he and his brother have a little history. I briefly mentioned the arcade game Donkey Kong. Well, let me dive deeper into that. In that game, you play a character whom at the time everyone called him Jumpman, with the goal of getting back his girlfriend, Pauline, from the titular character Donkey Kong, who was 0% Donkey and 100% Kong. The game's developer, Shigeru Miyamoto, man is he going to be important this season, decided to name this character Mario, after his Italian-American landlord, Mario Zagalli, who he himself would barge into the offices of Nintendo of America demanding the rent to be paid. Hey, the man wants his dough. Miyamoto would take the character of Mario and make an entire game based on him. He also created a brother for the Jumpman, Luigi. The brothers would get their own arcade game in 1983, simply titled Mario Brothers. It was also released for the Famicom and later the NES. It was a simple game really. The brothers, Mario and Luigi, are plumbers, and the objective of the game is to defeat all of the enemies, which are turtles, in each phase. However, you can only kill an enemy unless they are on their back, or you can hit the power block at the bottom center and kill them all. It will continue unless you lose all of your lives. I forgot to mention that upon its release, Nintendo marketed it as the third Donkey Kong game in the series. Donkey Kong Jr., which had Mario as the villain, was the sequel to the original. And funny enough, the actual sequel, Donkey Kong 3, was released in the same year. Anyhow, Miyamoto was not done with the brothers. Because of his knowledge from working on Devil World, Excitebike, and Kung Fu, released in 1984, he, along with Takashi Tezuka and music composer Koji Kondo, decided to make further advancements in the platforming genre, which are basically side-scrolling games. And the rest is history. The Super Mario Bros., a launch title for the NES in late 1985, was a massive success for both the console and the company. How is that possible when the public was so skeptical when it comes to games those days? Simple, by giving it a seal that basically reads, "Hey, it is a safe and guaranteed quality product," hence the official Nintendo seal of quality on the box art. Afterwards, Mario became Nintendo's very own mascot. Well, one of them. He was not the only one with his game being successful. The Legend of Zelda and Metroid in 1986 would also find their success on the console. Alright, let's switch gears to the PC, shall we? There were no shortages of PCs. While Microsoft Corporation, a company founded in 1975 by William Henry Gates III, Bill Gates, and Paul Allen, remember the former for later, trust me, was getting started with their Microsoft Windows here in the States, the PC-88, X60000, NEC PC, and MSX were very popular in the Japanese market. The latter of which is very interesting because there's one game that caught the attention of some, if not most, consumers. Originally, this game was supposed to be intended as an action game featuring military combat. However, it was going to be impossible since the MSX2 was very limited in its hardware, and considering that it was going to be a side-scrolling shooter, I'm pretty sure the MSX2 would melt and set your entire house on fire. Now, here is where the design mechanics of the game would change thanks to one man who originally wanted to be a film director but opted for the gaming genre. Hideo Kojima turned it from a side-scrolling shooter to more of a stealth and puzzle-like game like Pac-Man. The enemies would only be detected if they've seen you or you just happen to sneeze on them, and it would have a mech to deactivate and a story behind it. Originally, it was going to be called Intruder, but it was changed to the game's mech of the same name. Metal Gear, released on the MSX2 in 1987 and on the Famicom and NES in the same year and 1988 respectively. Your only objective of the game? Find Metal Gear and destroy it. But there are some twists and turns as you go along. Both versions of Metal Gear were a success. Konami, the company that distributed Metal Gear, began developing the sequel titled Snake's Revenge, which doesn't make any sense to be honest, only on the NES. Kojima had nothing to do with it. In fact, Kojima himself was not planning on making a sequel until he got wind of Snake's Revenge. After much talk, he convinced the businessman at Konami to make a sequel that he would be involved with. Its name, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. That game has a lot more story than the original. And come on, who doesn't know the theme of Solid Snake? I mean, like, come on. In fact, it was like a massive beta test for another game that I will talk about later. But for now, let's head on back to the consoles, because we have a new contender. For the next 3 years, Nintendo dominated, and things like Nintendo Power, a magazine made by the company themselves, were popular. Sequels like Super Mario Bros. 2, Japan and US, don't ask, and Super Mario Bros. 3 met the same amount of success. However, there was one that decided to join the console market. Enter Sega! Actually, Sega was already in the console market before the crash in '83. The SG-1000 comes to mind. It, along with the Sega Mark III, the Master System, didn't do well against the Famicom, but to them, it was a learning curve. Because in the late 80s, Sega decided to do something insane. Now, the NES and the Famicom, as well as Sega's previous systems, were running 8-bit games. The 8-bit part refers to the amount of pixels on screen. Sega's new console would gain 8 more. In 1988, Sega released their new 16-bit console, the Sega Mega Drive, in Japan. However, when it came to North America, well, the US, in 1989, it was given a new name, the Sega Genesis. I'm calling it the Genesis Mega Drive, or GMD for short. It was the start of the 4th generation of video game consoles. The NES and Master System were the 3rd. However, it did not beat the NES in its debut. It had limited success in porting arcade games to the GMD, sure, but Sega needed something new. Tom Kalinske was hired to be president of Sega of America. At the same time, the company wanted a mascot to rival Nintendo's Mario and everyone else. Then, president of Sega proper, Hayao Nakayama, wanted a character that was as popular as the mouse from Disney. You know, that mouse who's been going around suing everyone. They went with fast animals and considered using a rabbit, but it was changed to an armadillo, then a hedgehog, taking some inspiration from Michael Jackson. As far as the villain, he was inspired by President Theodore Roosevelt, especially with that bitchin' mustache, and made him look like a round egg with arms and legs. And the rest was off to the races, no pun intended. Sonic the Hedgehog was released for the Genesis Mega Drive in June of 1991, and the Blue Blur smashed it in sales. The object of the game, free all of the animals trapped in pods, as well as badniks, and defeat the menacing fat egg bastard known in Japan as Dr. Eggman, but here in the West as Dr. Ivo Robotnik. Both names will be accepted by both parties in the coming years. But then, the Super Famicom, or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, SNES, was released in 1990, along with Super Mario World, the 4th, technically 5th, Mario game as a launch title that sold over 20 million copies. Along with it came Street Fighter II The World Warrior, developed by Capcom, a company still around today, ported to the console from the arcade. All of a sudden, there was a sense of competition between the two companies. A true console war, if you will. And not like this phony war that's going on Twitter nowadays. Yeah, it's called Twitter. Fuck off, Elon. On one side, you have Nintendo telling you, now you're playing with power, superpower. On the other side, you have Sega telling you that the Genesis does what Nintendo don't. A true, healthy competition. But I did mention both the arcade and Street Fighter. The former, sadly, because of the console and PC markets, the arcade would decline even further, never to reach the heights of what it once was. And while arcades would continue in Japan, it would not be the same story here in the US. Arcades did make a resurgence in the early 1990s, but towards the late 90s, they were declining. However, the arcade did usher in something that honestly should have been there to begin with. And it ain't Street Fighter that did it, it will be another fighting game in 1992, Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat was basically Street Fighter, but with its bloody, gruesome, and brutal fatalities raised to fucking 11. And this had parents considered for a bit, but then came another game in 1993, this time a first-person shooter on PC that really got people's attention, Doom by id Software, who are still around today. Doom was also one of those games that had a lot more gore and blood. Needless to say, parents, later politicians, collectively flipped their shit. Both Doom and Mortal Kombat, they considered, to be, in their words, bad for the children to play. Okay, let me stop you right there. That responsibility falls onto the parents and parents alone, and that still applies to this day. And even then, they still act like fucking Karens. Anyhow, it persisted when Mortal Kombat 2 and Doom 2 were released. And then, the United States Congress approved the creation of the Interactive Digital Software Association, later renamed to the Entertainment Software Association, in 1994, over 30 years ago. Along with their creation came the Entertainment Software Rating Board, ESRB. Like movies, each video game will be rated based on the content that's within said game. From RP, meaning rating pending, E for everyone, T for teenagers, and for mature audiences, though they fucking ignored it anyway, and later AO, meaning adults only. E10 Plus would come later in the mid-2000s. Similar rating systems were introduced in Europe with the Pan-European Game Information, PEGI for short, in 2003, and in Japan with the Computer Entertainment Rating Organization, CERO, with ratings similar to the ESRB. Now, there was a transitional period. PC games in the late 80s were shipped via the floppy disks, while the consoles still relied on the cartridge. In the arcade, there was an experiment being tested. Some of the games explored the idea of using laser discs, Dragon's Lair being the prime example. Instead of it being pixelated like any other game at the time, it was fully animated. That was made possible by animator Don Bluth. But I did mention Doom. Doom was one of those early examples of 3D gaming, and there lies the key phrase, 3D. Nintendo had something within the SNES, the Super FX graphics chip, that allowed games such as Star Fox, released in 1993, to be played in 3D. But when it comes to the Laserdisc, or just a simple disc, Sega was one step ahead with the Sega CD, an add-on to the Sega Genesis Mega Drive. And Sonic the Hedgehog CD, or Sonic CD, in '93 was one of those games that really worked on the disc format. But when it came time for the transition of games being made for the sole purpose of being played in 3D graphics, there are a few arcade games that did that during the 1990s. Battlezone, Tempest, and Star Wars, all made by Atari, were those games that used the wireframe vector graphics that made simulating 3D graphics possible. On the PC, many games had 3D elements, such as Hover Tank 3D, Catacomb 3D, and eventually Wolfenstein 3D, the latter of which was considered to be the first-person shooter that allowed environments to be rendered in 3D for the player to travel in, all made by id Software's John Carmack and Romeo. Then came along Ultra Underworld from Blue Sky Productions, later Looking Glass Studios, terrible fucking name, and using game engines such as id Tech 01, or the Doom engine, it made games such as Duke Nukem 3D by 3D Realms and Marathon by Bungie, remember them for a future episode, wink wink, possible. In 1996, id Software developed and published Quake, the first true 3D game on PC. With it came the new engine, the Quake engine. Later on, 1 year later, new graphics cards will be in high demand for FPS games on PC. Unreal Engine by Epic Games, an engine that is still evolving today. Gold Scar, made by Valve, and CryEngine by German developer Crytek. However, what about the console side of things? Well, the consoles were still in the 2D phase. That is, until the consoles would make the jump into the next generation, with the promise of all of their games being 3D going forward. The 3DO and Jaguar entered the 5th console generation, but in general, those consoles would not be as popular as the competition, the latter of which would be Atari's final video game console. Nintendo and Sega, on the other hand, also entered the new generation with their new consoles. The Sega Saturn in late 1994, along with a Japanese guy telling you to play it or else he'll beat the shit out of you, no joke, no cap, and the Nintendo 64 with games such as Super Mario 64 as its launch title in 1996. The competition continues. But there would be another company that decided to walk through that door and enter the gaming console market. Sony Computer Entertainment, today's Sony Interactive Entertainment, had partnered with Nintendo on a new gaming console. The reason is that Sony executive Ken Kutaragi's interest stemmed from seeing his daughters playing on Nintendo's Famicom, the NES, which explains his willingness to work with the company. The concept of this game console, however, dates back all the way to 1988 when both Sony and Nintendo were working together, which resulted in the first prototype called the SNES CD, or the PlayStation, the two words were separate, based on the design of the SNES itself. The console was going to be announced at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, but Nintendo, mainly its president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, got, wary of Sony's leverage and was worried about the existing licensing structure of the company. As a result, the joint Nintendo-Sony project was ultimately cancelled without telling Sony themselves, kind of dickish. But that does not mean that the story ends. No sir. Kutaragi and Sony president Norio Oga decided that Sony would make their own console, and thanks to Nobuyuki Hidai acquiring the name beforehand, they managed to do just that. The PlayStation, nowadays called the PlayStation 1, you'll know why in a few minutes, was released to the public in December of 1994 and September of 1995. And they did come with games, but these became the most notable. Tekken in 1995, Resident Evil March 22, 1996, Crash Bandicoot September 9th, Tomb Raider October 25th, Final Fantasy VII January 31st, 1997, Gran Turismo, the original, the good one, December 23rd, 1997, and the most important out of all of them, I don't care, fight me, Metal Gear Solid September 3rd, 1998. And Nintendo was no slouch either, despite that controller looking like a ghost with an analog stick and buttons. The aforementioned Super Mario 64, Star Fox 64, Donkey Kong 64, Doom 64, do you see a pattern here? GoldenEye 007, Banjo-Kazooie, and Banjo-Tooie, both made by Rare, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, the former of which is regarded as one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, and for those on the competitive side, Super Smash Bros. And while Sega wasn't really lighting the world on fire with the Sega Saturn, please don't kill me Segata, they actually got a head start on the 6th generation with their next, and unfortunately their last, console, the Sega Dreamcast, released in late 1998 in Japan and later in the US and other countries in 1999. It was the first console to have a built-in internet connection giving you the option to play games, multiplayer games, online. Do you hear that, corporate? Back then it was a fucking option. Anyhow, the Dreamcast did have its fair share of games, most notable being Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Sonic Adventure, and Sonic Adventure 2, the latter of which introduced new characters, Rouge the Bat and Shadow the Hedgehog. However, despite the console developing a homebrew community around it, it would never meet its expectations and it was a commercial failure. As a result, Sega exited the console market and transitioned into a third-party development company, a spot that they are still occupying today. And as for the other companies, Nintendo released the GameCube, and I mean that literally like an actual cube, with notable games such as Super Mario Sunshine, even Mario can't get a good vacation no matter how hard he tries, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Sonic Heroes, the Hedgehog's debut into other consoles, keyword consoles. Because Sony would up the stakes as the new millennium dawned with, to this day, the best-selling video game console, I hear Nintendo is catching up, the PlayStation 2. And needless to say, they reigned supreme with a leading head start. Why is that? Because it had two things. One, the PS2 had the ability to play movies like a DVD player, since around that time DVDs were taking off. And two, well, to borrow a phrase from Oh No It's Alex, how you doing, mate? Sony got weird, both at marketing and the games themselves, some of which I will be reviewing in this season. And as for those games, well, I mean, come on. Don Hack, Devil May Cry, Jak and Daxter, Kingdom Hearts, even though I wasn't a fan, MGS2, Sons of Liberty, MGS3, Snake Eater, Final Fantasy X, I can go on forever. But as Sega exited the room, Microsoft kicked down the door with such aggression. 1 year after the PlayStation 2, Microsoft entered the gaming console market with the Xbox. Its background and story I will touch upon in greater detail in 2 episodes from now. Now, there are 2 games, not made by the same company but published by the same publisher, that are on the PS2, the Xbox, and the PC, sorry Nintendo, that grew into franchises. And one of them is the focal point of today's review. And in order to talk about the game itself, we have to talk about the company that made it. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get into the actual review. After the official intro to the podcast, I had a feeling which I haven't felt in a long time. The feeling of, so far so good. This episode would have been shorter, but I guess it was time to teach the audience on how gaming got to this point in the first place. Guess it wouldn't hurt to learn something. Anyway, it's time to get to the meat of the matter. In 1996, Remedy Entertainment, founded on August 18th the previous year, and after completing their first game called Death Rally, have been developing an idea for a third-person action game, a subgenre of games where instead of a perspective of the player's eye while shooting someone, first-person view, you would see the character's whole body with the camera behind the person. The inspiration behind this is because of the success of Tomb Raider, though they want to avoid the terrible camera issues. Sam Lake, the writer, stated that the story would be the starting point where this archetype of the private eye, the hard-boiled cop, would be used in a game with a more deeper and psychological feeling. The prototype and design of this game, with working titles like Dark Justice and Maxi, look it up for yourselves, I'm not doing it for you, was created and shown to 3D Realms Entertainment. 3DR liked it, signed a development deal, and got to work on its production. Now, here's where things get really interesting. While developing the game, they decided to not produce cutscenes using the in-game engine, of which they still do half the time, but produce cutscenes using the comic panels with voiceover. The reason for this is that the budget for the game is very small, and they did state that it would be much harder to develop that kind of style with the in-game or pre-rendered video footage that is not rendered with the game's engine in real time, cinematics. Speaking of the game's engine, it will be dubbed Max FX. As far as the music, that will be done by Kartsi Hataka, the only Finnish name that I can actually pronounce. How sad. The game's first trailer was showcased at E3, Electronic Entertainment Expo for short, in 1998, and it attracted some attention, though 3DR intentionally did not overhype it. The game was originally scheduled for a summer of 1999 release, but it was delayed over and over again. But during that time, its graphics were revamped to feature more detailed textures and lighting, and the multiplayer mode, which was going to be released with it, dropped. The end result is Max Payne, released on Windows PC on July 24, 2001, and later on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox on December 7 and 18 respectively. That was made possible by the port's publisher, Rockstar Games, a subsidiary of Take-Two Interactive, and overall, it sold decently, selling over 4 million units on all platforms. And here is when I get into the plot synopsis, because fuck doing the entire plot. Anyhow, the synopsis courtesy of Ken Winseng of IMDb. Max Payne, a cop in the NYPD, returns home one day to find his wife and baby daughter murdered at the hands of drug addicts, high on a designer drug called Valkyr. After 3 years of working on the case, Max and his best friend Alex go undercover to bust a V deal. However, things go wrong. Alex is suddenly killed, and Max is framed for his murder. Hunted by the cops and driven by determination to avenge his family, Max Payne sets out to uncover the truths behind his family's murder. Phew. And now for my thoughts. Given that I don't have this game on PC, I'm reviewing the OG Xbox version, which is backwards compatible on the Xbox Series X. So, here goes. I think this game doesn't get appreciated all that much today, because this was very enjoyable. I love the graphic novel cutscenes throughout, making me feel like I'm reading an interactive comic book. Well, comic book in a sense that you're actually playing it. Speaking of playing, for a console port, it actually plays really well, with a few minor flaws. Given that this was a port released in 2001, why the hell am I old? The controls had to be made so that the player wouldn't tear his or her hair out, and the controls are very nice. Now, the game does have a tutorial, so you can play around with and mess around with the control scheme whenever you wish. Yes, you can adjust the settings on how Max can be played, pretty much a standard issue at this point. And speaking of the issue, I imagine that it feels good with PC players being able to control, look, and shoot with the mouse and keyboard. I said the controls are nice, but that has its issues. Firstly, the Xbox and PlayStation versions have auto aim assist, the definition of which is a feature where it could help players aim and shoot at a target. The feature works well enough, however, the manual aiming is really stiff, and I'm talking about when certain explosives cannot be auto-locked. This applies to the movement as well. I don't know what it is like on PC, you guys can tell me on that part, but Max Payne, while decently controlled, is very stiff, and that has everything to do with the way that he moves. Now, usually when you move the left stick up slightly, you expect him to walk, right? Well, no. The thing is, he runs all of the time, and it gets really frustrating when you have to walk along the blood trails. Thankfully, there are only 2 of them, but I fucking hated these sections because you have to be very careful when you walk on them. It's nothing but a black empty space. It gets super aggravating given that you have to follow the sounds. The trails are super narrow, so you have to watch your step because if you move slightly to the left or right, it causes you to react immediately, causing you to fall off, and even in the second section, it can be a bitch to navigate. It is slowed down when you reach these sections so that you have enough time to react, but that doesn't save it. Actually, speaking of slowing down, there is one feature that stands out from the other third-person shooters, and that is bullet time. Press a certain button or key and time slows down, allowing you to get out of the way of bullets and fire with some accuracy. And this extends to the bullet time combo, where you pretend you're in the Matrix and leap forward, dodging and shooting. It's pretty satisfying. However, it does have a cooldown system, and the only way to refill it is to kill enemies. The weapons in this game are very simple, from a baseball bat that you rarely use except for this one level, let's be honest, to your pistols, your submachine guns, your shotguns, assault rifle, grenades, mollies, Molotov cocktails, sniper rifle, and of course, the grenade launcher. Though the explosive range is very huge, so watch out. Painkillers are there to give you health, but you can only use 8 of them, so use them sparingly. Sometimes in later levels, enemies would drop painkillers. A lot of the time, you have to find them yourself, in cabinets, drawers, what have you. I love the fact that this game is like a puzzle. I'll admit, on the last level, I got kind of frustrated with the amount of times I died on my first playthrough. But during the second one, the one that I did for this channel, I managed to find out which and what way I have to approach an area. Multiple enemies? Frag them out. Shotgun guy? Out shotgun him. An enemy around the corner? Hit that bullet time and they're fucking done. That is very useful when you see a dickhead with an assault rifle or shotgun. Though they would come around the corner and kill you first, so be on the alert. And that goes for the environment around you. At certain parts, paths have to be created, and I love it. Thinking about where to go, but stumbling upon something that will help me progress through the level is the most rewarding thing ever, and I wish today's game designs would do that instead of handing it to me on a plate. Anyhow, let's move on. The voice acting is decent. Max is voiced well, especially with the narration that is all over. It's entertaining and hilarious at points. But the others are questionable. I couldn't help but feel that some lines didn't have a second take. And unfortunately, the music isn't anything to write home about. The main theme and Mr. Big are very ominous, but that's really the only thing of note. Overall, Max Payne is a very good game. It does have its flaws, sure, but the experience throughout was never tiring and I never got bored. It's available on Steam and the Xbox Marketplace, so check it out. And so, the new season kicks off with a bang. But I did mention that this is one of 2 games published by Rockstar. Mates, get your keys, get your guns, and grab your rhino tanks because we're going to Liberty. Until then, thank you all for watching or listening. If you would like to see more, then subscribe to the channel. Be well, stay safe, take care of yourselves, and have a good day. It was all done. The final sentence is a signal to the audience that the first episode of the 3rd season was complete. I placed my hand on the mouse and moved the cursor to the stop button on my Audacity. I leaned back in my gaming chair, and it was finished. And so, a new journey has begun. While I do have priorities on the main channel, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief after many months of preparations. How will I balance the novels, let's plays, and reviews? I guess time will tell.